Today, the little wonky deep dive into a word that may be the epitome of government speak. It's a word synonymous with bureaucracy and red tape. The word we're talking about is procurement, something we're hearing a lot more about these days. The official definition is the act of obtaining or acquiring something. The unofficial definition, a process run by an undemocratic, small d, set of rules that define government contracting in the 21st century. Just last week, President Obama told me procurement was one of the reasons why his healthcare website wasn't working as planned.
Probably the biggest gap between the private sector and the federal government is when it comes to IT. How we procure it, how we purchase it. This has been true on a whole range of projects.
And you know what your supporters say? You had a great campaign website. How did you not be able to do this?
Well, the reason is that when it comes to my campaign, I'm not constrained by a bunch of federal procurement rules, right? And how we write specifications and how the whole thing gets built out. So part of what I'm going to be looking at is how do we, across the board, across the federal government, leap into the 21st century?
All right, we'll set aside the whole private sector versus government. It sounded sometimes like a conservative argument versus a liberal argument, but the truth is the problem goes much deeper, and it has its roots in his first term in office. Back in 2010, the administration put a hold on some $3 billion worth of tech projects in an attempt to reduce costs and improve functionality. Officials said rules for obtaining government contracts were outdated and weren't necessarily getting the best people on the job. In fact, a firm called the Standish Group analyzed major IT projects that year, including government projects, and found, ready for this, just 1 out of 3 were successful. More than 60% of government IT projects were either late, over budget, or simply outright failures. That December, the president's chief technology officer, Vivek Kundra, released a 25-point plan to fix IT management. Among his ideas, speed up the process and take down barriers to get smaller tech companies more involved. He wrote that, quote, ultimately, the government contracting process is easier to navigate by large existing players who in turn dominate the volume of contracts and therefore create a track record, making them look less risky and more likely to win future contracts. Kundra left the job less than a year later, denouncing what he described as an IT cartel within federal IT, referring to the legal hoops companies needed to jump through to win bids. He said the companies that win government contracts do so because, quote, they understand the procurement process better than anyone else and not because they provide better technology. So without smaller companies getting involved, there's less competition as well as less pressure to deliver results quickly and under budget. Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal told me yesterday that it's also impacting federal agencies across the board, including the VA.
This IT issue is one that is government-wide in terms of the costs of procurement, the delays in instituting it, then using outmoded technology. It is a problem government-wide.
Of course, the most obvious example is healthcare.gov. CGI Federal beat out 3 other companies for the job in 2011. Bidders that had been pre-certified years earlier, meaning newer and smaller companies were simply shut out of the bidding process. And it may be no surprise that the costs, shockingly, started to rise almost immediately. 2011, CGI reported that its contract was $93 million. But reports from Reuters and the Washington Post show that the government could end up paying the company more than twice that. So how did a president who ran the most tech-savvy campaign in U.S. history wind up with an information technology system like this one? Joining me now is Clay Johnson. He's founder and CEO of the Department of Better Technology. It's a nonprofit that develops technology for governments. He's also a former Presidential Innovation Fellow and lead programmer for Howard Dean's 2004 campaign. Clay, you have been probably the reporter that has, or the analyst that has written the most by this. Excuse me, I'm saying reporter, but you have written a lot about this issue. I hope I scratched the surface of the issue, but go ahead and go deeper for me.
Well, yeah, I think what's happened is that there's a new kind of digital divide in this country, and instead of it being between the rich and the poor, it's between industry and the private sector and government. And what we have to do is really, I think, change the policy such that government can keep up at a reasonable pace and acquire the right kind of technology. I mean, you can see it in the everyday technology that government uses, where, you know, you and I are probably carrying around an iPhone or an Android, and, you know, a government employee is still on their, 2006 BlackBerry because it hasn't been upgraded yet.
Hey, let me ask you this. So you said you have maintained that part of the reason why these bigger firms win is simply they hire better lawyers and they understand how to get through. I think you said there were 1,800 pages of legalese on some of these government contracts that when you're bidding for it, that lawyers have to go through. So what has to be changed in the law? Where does this start? We know that the president, I've heard him talk about this before, but obviously you can't do this with executive mandates or some sort of executive actions. It has to be done in the legislative branch. So what needs to be done?
Well, I think the first thing that can be done is you can raise what's called the simplified acquisition threshold. Now, that's a lot of syllables, but
that is.
The simplified acquisition threshold says, all right, well, we have this, right now it's at $150,000. We have this $150,000 cap, and everything underneath that, we don't need to have a big rigmarole with. We can do procurements pretty easily through underneath that simplified acquisition threshold. I think probably what needs to change is we should raise that from $150,000 to about $500,000, but make it so that that only goes to small businesses, small new businesses, so that we start with smaller projects and we can grow these small businesses into the large suppliers, into companies that can take on something like healthcare.gov when they need to. I think the other thing that is sort of missing from this conversation is the idea of security clearances. Security clearances take a long time, and oftentimes contracts require your employees to have a security clearance and require you to pay for their security clearance, and that security clearance costs tens of thousands of dollars. So it's not just that that government has a limited number of companies that they can choose from. It's also that those companies have a limited amount of talent that they can hire from to do those jobs.
You know, if the federal government were a corporation, right, and truly were sort of run that way, the president who decided to have a CIO, a CTO position, however you want to refer to it, but he had a chief information officer, chief technology officer, that essentially out of OMB. But there are, every agency has its own IT system. Do we need essentially a actual department of IT for the federal government that truly has control over these IT systems throughout the federal government, rather than just sort of essentially being a glorified help desk?
Well, I think we need a better brain. I think we need a more centralized, a more authoritative brain. I mean, the truth is inside of government is that the CIO of the federal government and the CTO of the federal government don't have very much power over what agencies can do. They're not, you know, a regulatory body. They can't say, hey, EPA, we want you to buy this or do things that way. That's just not something that they have the power to do.
Should they?
Yeah, I think they should. I think that the White House needs to open up an office of digital services inside of the White House and really be sort of a central hub for both acquiring talent for technology for agencies and also sometimes implementing that technology itself for agency. If we can hire some smart people, some smart programmers, some smart technologists, the things that they can do will be amazing. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, when they started up, they really took technology to heart, and you don't hear a lot about how they have a lot of messed up technology, and that's because they really put technology in the heart of what they're doing from the get-go, and I think that the White House can learn from that and maybe adopt some of their techniques for all the agencies.
But how did they blow by some of these procurement rules?
Well, they did it through hiring. They hired really great people, and those people can generally make better technology decisions because they themselves are smart, and they do a lot in-house. So they can develop a tool and then hire a contractor to work on that tool with them, rather than basically pushing all of the operational knowledge outside of the agencies.
And I want to go back to Congress here a minute. What do they need to do? I mean, I hate to suggest the start of a new committee, but when I think about jurisdiction here, it isn't obvious to me who's in charge of all the federal IT issues in the legislative branch.
Well, that's part of the problem, is that there isn't somebody that's in charge of procurement. Procurement is sort of a community-driven, committee-driven process. There's no sort of chief procurement officer. The closest thing is the administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, which, whew, what a title.
Yeah,
not
big business card.
Right, not a particularly sort of power title like a chief technology officer, chief information officer. But the real problem with Congress is that, you know, if you watch some of these hearings, it's a lot like watching my 1-year-old argue with my cat. Nobody seems to know what's going on. And that's because in the mid-90s, Congress decided to lobotomize itself and get rid of the Technology Assessment Office, the technology brain power of Congress.
Right. Well, and that clearly a major problem there. Anyway, Clay Johnson, we only scratched the surface on this issue. The word procurement, not quite everyday language here in Washington, but it unfortunately is getting there. Clay, thanks for your help on this.
Thanks for having me.